The simplest way that I can put this is long-term athletic development is doing the simple stuff really, really well from a young age and then slowly adding in complexity. And when I say complexity, I'm talking about more specificity. So a very simple example is think about how many athletes like specialize in a sport at a very early age. Like baseball is a great example. How many like world or like junior World Series baseball players actually make it to the majors? It's a very small percentage, right? So in general, our goal as coaches and as potentially as parents or even as advocates is how do we get a broader array of experiences from a younger age so that this person has more things to draw from. So if we this is why the idea of like playing multiple sports, gym class, like being able to skip and do basic bodyweight movements from a young age is so important. It's kind of like this idea of going back to building blocks. How do we give these kids all these prerequisite movement abilities so that they can solve more movement problems? So, simple example, say we have an individual who's played like three different sports. Say they play football, they play basketball, maybe they do track and field. The demands of those three different sports are very, very different. And it also allows them, even if they're playing all three sports at different phases, it allows them the ability not to do the same thing year round. So when we talk about like this acquisition of a broad array of movements, track and field is going to work a lot on power, elasticity, linear speed development. Things like basketball and football are going to work on a lot more like side to side, a lot more team sport oriented. So it's more reactive. So think about the nature of the sport that they're doing and also think about like what are the physical demands of that sport. If we have an athlete who all they do is the same sport or the same type of activity, say it's just track and field and weightlifting or something like that, their ability to respond to uncertain demands and their ability to change direction and change levels is probably going to be much less than somebody who's a three-sport athlete who also does something like basketball or football or wrestling. And going back to what Rufus said before, imagine a gymnast. Like gymnastics and martial arts, in my opinion, are some of the best things to do early on for younger individuals because it teaches you really, really good body weight competence. So it's essentially going back to sensation. One of the reasons that like gymnasts are so good at sensing is they're constantly doing body weight movements at varying intensities and at varying speeds. So think about something like a floor routine. They're doing all sorts of flips. They're landing. They're on one leg. They're on two legs. They're on their hands. They're doing handstands. They're upside down. Like think about like the Olympic rings and the uneven bars. They have to have such a broad array of abilities and tolerate so many different types of forces that their understanding of their body has to be very, very good, right? Versus if you're doing a sport like I'll pick on myself, if you're an Olympic lifter or a power lifter, you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, but there's very little variability in terms of the task that you're actually doing. So going back to long-term athletic development, we want to have a high level of variability and a relatively high level of uncertainty for different, as many demands as possible. Because if we do that from a young age and we don't specialize too soon, as we get older and older, it gives us more options to pull from so that our likelihood of success becomes much greater as we get older and older. And it also goes back to, there's a reason that I think our athletic peak is usually like what, late 20s, early 30s from like a performance standpoint. So if you've played more sports and you've done more things as a younger individual, when you get to that pinnacle of like actual physical performance and physical maturity, you can use more of those capabilities at the highest outputs. Like the really cool topic of like nature versus nurture, right? Like nature, like what are you born with? Like what's your physical height going to be? What are your anthropometrics? Like Mike Phelps of the world, right? Like if you're purposely built for the sport, you can't teach that. That's just born into you, right? That's inherited. Versus the nurture, like you could have all of the athletic potential in the world, but if you don't have the right coach or you're not exposed to that sport, it doesn't matter. So then the question becomes like, the only thing we can really influence is nurture. So athletic potential essentially is like, how can I expose this person to as many movements and positions and sports and activities as possible and figure out what they're good at? Like that's essentially what we're doing as coaches. We're giving them a broad array of movements and challenges and basically asking them to figure out what they can do or how to do it better. And essentially, it's almost like I almost think of like heredity as like toggle switches, like on and off switches. You can have all this like genetic potential, but say you're Mike Phelps and you never got into the pool. Like those switches were never turned on because you were never exposed to those challenges or to those demands. And the more things you're exposed to, potentially the greater array of things you're going to be able to do, right? So that's what like skipping, hopping, running, jumping, pitching. Those are like these basic movement qualities that oftentimes are getting left out at a very young age. And then when we challenge people as adults, they can't do those things. So they're missing a lot of these like prerequisite options. So
Yep.
yeah, it's like we become indoctrinated into the system of like, we have to move in certain ways versus just, hey, let's just move in a lot of ways and see what works for us.